and spent most of his time stationed at a base in Japan. At some point, her mother found out that he was seeing another woman there, but instead of filing for divorce, she moved to another town, leaving the children with their father. He took them to Japan with him, and Nancy spent the next several years living there. When she was 13, they returned to the United States, and Nancy decided that she wanted to reconnect with her mother. She moved in with her in a small Texas town where her grandparents also lived. Over the next few years, Nancy and her mother became very close. Nancy was also doing well at school, and because she wanted to help her mother financially, she began working different part-time jobs while she was still a teenager. While she was in high school, Nancy met a boy named Todd, and their relationship became serious very quickly. Before long, they were talking about getting married and starting a family, which made Nancy's mother uneasy. She wanted Nancy to finish college and find a good job before settling down, but Nancy was determined to stay with Todd no matter what. On the day she turned 18, Nancy and Todd ran away to another town, and a few months later, they got married. Todd then joined the military, and the couple moved to Austin where he was stationed. Sometime later, Nancy gave birth to their daughter, Sylvia. By 1988, Sylvia was just over a year old, and Nancy was 20. Todd was still serving at a base near their home, while Nancy had started working at Pizza Hut. She was hardworking, reliable, and took her job seriously, so it wasn't long before she was promoted to assistant manager. So, by the age of 20, Nancy had a loving husband, a young daughter, and a good job. Her mother had eventually accepted her decision to marry Todd, and the two of them had repaired their relationship, which meant a lot to Nancy. She had also gotten into softball, and she and Todd played whenever they had the chance. On Monday, October 24th, Nancy was scheduled to work the evening shift. However, she also had a softball game that night, so she asked management to move her to the morning shift instead. That day, Nancy woke up early and drove to work with her daughter. She and Todd had a routine they followed whenever they were both working early, since it was still too soon for Nancy to drop Sylvia off at the babysitter's house herself. Nancy would drive to the restaurant with Sylvia in her car, while Todd followed behind them on his motorcycle. Once they arrived, he would leave the motorcycle in the Pizza Hut parking lot, take the car, and drive Sylvia to the babysitter. He would then return to the restaurant, say goodbye to Nancy, and leave the car with her before heading to the military base on his motorcycle. That Monday was no different. They arrived at the Pizza Hut at around 7 in the morning, and a little less than an hour later, Todd returned after dropping Sylvia off. He knocked on the door, handed Nancy the car keys, then left for work. Even though Nancy arrived at the restaurant that early, it did not open to customers until 11, which was still 4 hours away. Until then, she was supposed to prepare the restaurant for the day and make the pizza dough, all while working there alone. At around 8:30 a.m., the district manager began calling Pizza Hut locations across the city. This was part of his usual routine, and it allowed him to make sure that every restaurant was being prepared for opening. But when he called Nancy's location, no one answered, which immediately seemed unusual. He tried calling several more times over the next hour, and when Nancy still failed to pick up, he decided to drive over and check on the restaurant himself. As soon as he approached the building, he noticed something strange. The employee entrance was standing open, even though staff members were required to keep every door locked while preparing the restaurant before opening. When he stepped inside, he found water covering the floor, but Nancy was nowhere in sight. He walked toward the kitchen and heard the dough mixer running, which told him that Nancy had arrived and started preparing for the day, but he had no idea where she had gone afterward. As he approached the restrooms, he realized that the water seemed to be coming from the men's room. He opened the door and was met with a horrifying sight. Nancy was lying beneath the sink, unclothed, with her hands tied behind her back. There was also a large amount of blood around her head. The manager immediately ran out of the restroom and called 911. When paramedics arrived and saw Nancy, they initially believed that she was already dead. To their surprise, however, she still had a faint pulse, so they rushed her to the hospital. While doctors fought to save her life, police began examining the crime scene. Based on Nancy's condition, it appeared that the attacker had forced her to remove her clothes, tied her hands with her own bra, and then shot her in the head. Her clothing was still lying on the restroom floor, and nearby, investigators found a single spent .22 caliber shell casing. They also discovered that someone had stuffed an apron into the sink drain and left the water running, causing the sink to overflow and flood the floor. In the dining area, crime scene technicians found a short strand of hair that they believed might have belonged to the attacker, so it was collected and sent to a lab for testing. Police also noted that the safe built into the floor had been emptied. Cash was normally left inside overnight, and one of the morning employees' first responsibilities was to remove the money and count it. This gave investigators a general idea of what might have happened. It appeared that someone had entered the restaurant intending to rob it, but had also decided to sexually assault Nancy before shooting her. The fact that Nancy had been found without her clothes led police to consider that possibility, although at that point they had no physical evidence confirming that a sexual assault had taken place. Restaurant robberies were fairly common in the area at the time. 4 other Pizza Hut locations nearby had recently been robbed, but no one had been injured in any of those cases. Those robberies had also happened late in the evening or at night, when restaurants were still open, but there were few, if any, customers inside. What happened at Nancy's restaurant was clearly different. After investigating every entrance, investigators found no signs of forced entry. Since employees were supposed to keep the doors locked until the restaurant opened, police were left with 2 main possibilities. Either Nancy knew the attacker and let him inside, or he had a master key that could open every Pizza Hut in the district. All assistant managers, including Nancy, had one of those keys, as did several higher-ranking employees, which meant the list of people with access was quite long. While police continued processing the restaurant, doctors were still trying to save Nancy, but the damage from the gunshot was too severe. She was placed in a medically induced coma, and doctors told Todd that there was no chance she would regain consciousness, so he would have to make the devastating decision to remove her from life support. Later that night, Nancy's loved ones came to the hospital to say their goodbyes. And after she passed away, the case officially became a murder investigation. As expected, medical examiners found a .22 caliber bullet lodged in Nancy's head, which had caused severe damage to her brain. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere on her body, suggesting that the attacker had caught her completely off guard and left her with no real chance to defend herself. The examination also confirmed that Nancy had been sexually assaulted, and the investigators were able to recover biological material left behind by her killer. The problem was that in the late 1980s, DNA testing was still in its early stages, so the tools available to investigators were extremely limited. The same issue applied to the short hair found in the dining area. Because it had no root attached, experts could not obtain a DNA profile from it, which meant they could only compare it with hair samples from possible suspects under a microscope. In other words, detectives were now searching for a killer with almost no useful evidence. Apart from the possibility that the limited DNA testing available at the time might eventually point them in the right direction. They first spoke with the manager who had found Nancy and quickly determined that he could not have been responsible. He had spent the entire morning in his office, where he had been making calls and speaking with employees at several different locations. Investigators also learned that at around 8:30 that morning, Nancy had called the company that supplied the restaurant. The district manager first tried to reach her at roughly the same time, but by then she was no longer answering the phone. This narrowed the likely time of the attack to around 8:30 or shortly afterward. It also allowed detectives to quickly rule out Nancy's husband. Todd had already arrived at the military base before Nancy made her final phone call, which meant he could not physically have committed the crime. Over the next several days, detectives interviewed every employee who worked at Nancy's restaurant, but none of them raised any serious concerns. They all had alibis, and investigators found no reason to believe that any of them had been involved in the murder. Police then obtained a list of employees at other Pizza Hut locations across the city who had access to a master key and began looking into them one by one. The process moved slower because the department had limited resources, but on November 9th, just a few weeks after the murder, detectives received an intriguing tip. By that point, the restaurant had reopened, and management had hired a security guard who told the manager about something he had found suspicious. One evening, two young men pulled up outside the restaurant and sat in their car across from the building for some time, with the headlights still on. They eventually came inside, ordered some beer, and began raising their glasses and making toasts in Nancy's memory. The guard thought their behavior was strange, but things got even more suspicious when one of the men approached him and started asking questions. He wanted to know how long the restaurant had had a security guard, whether the police had any suspects or evidence, and what else was known about Nancy's murder. At one point, he asked whether it was true that Nancy's body had been found near the cash register, and he even suggested that there must have been two killers. The guard later learned that both men worked at another Pizza Hut location. One of them also said that he had been opening his own restaurant at the time Nancy was killed, which supposedly gave him an alibi. The entire encounter seemed suspicious enough that the guard reported it to the manager, who then contacted detectives. Investigators identified the two men as 22-year-old Christopher Ochoa and 18-year-old Richard Danziger. They worked at another Pizza Hut and shared an apartment, while Richard was also dating the manager of that restaurant, a woman named Donna. This meant that both men had access to a master key and would have been familiar with the routine followed by employees working the morning shift. But that was not the only thing detectives learned. After speaking with the manager of their restaurant, they discovered that Richard had been scheduled to open the location at 8 on the morning Nancy was murdered, but when the time came, no one was there. The manager called Richard's girlfriend Donna, who said that he was at her house and had overslept. In the end, the manager had to go and open the restaurant himself, while Richard and Donna did not arrive until about 30 minutes later, sometime after 10 in the morning. Detectives first went to the apartment Richard shared with Christopher, but neither of them was there. So they headed to Donna's house and found Richard inside. The officers said they wanted to ask him a few questions and invited him down to the station, but his reaction immediately raised concerns. Richard said he had been expecting them and was surprised it had taken them so long to show up. He then pointed at Donna and said, "That's my alibi." According to Richard, he and Christopher had gone to Donna's house the night before and stayed there drinking until late. Richard spent the night with his girlfriend, but slept through his shift and only woke up after his manager called Donna. She confirmed Richard's story, but added that alcohol made her sleep very deeply, so if he had left the house early that morning, she might not have noticed. While listening to all of this, detectives spotted a contradiction. According to the security guard who had first reported the men's strange behavior, Richard had specifically claimed that he was opening his own restaurant at the time Nancy was murdered, which supposedly gave him an alibi. But now detectives knew that he had not arrived at work until several hours after the crime. Richard eventually agreed to go with them to the station, where he made several more interesting statements. When detectives asked what he knew about the murder, he mentioned a number of surprisingly specific details. Richard knew that Nancy had been shot with a .22 caliber weapon, and he also knew that the killer had plugged the sink with a blue apron to flood the restaurant. None of that information had been released to the public, so detectives had an obvious question. How did Richard know those details? He claimed that he had heard them from the security guard at Nancy's restaurant when the two of them spoke. But detectives had already interviewed the guard, and he had told them that he knew almost nothing about the crime. When detectives confronted Richard with this, he changed his explanation and said that he might have heard it from his manager instead. One of the detectives immediately called the manager and asked what caliber the bullet had been and what color apron was used to block the drain. But he could not answer either question. When detectives told Richard outright that they suspected him of killing Nancy, he remained defiant, insisting that they had no evidence and would never be able to pin the murder on him. Despite his suspicious behavior, the police did have to let him go. They still had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, which meant they had no grounds to charge him. Detectives then brought Christopher in for questioning, and his behavior was noticeably different from Richard's. While Richard had appeared calm and confident, Christopher was clearly nervous, although he also denied having anything to do with Nancy's murder. He confirmed that the three of them had spent the night before the killing drinking at Donna's house. According to Christopher, Richard stayed there overnight, while he drove back to their apartment alone. Even so, detectives felt that Christopher was hiding something. They doubted that he had taken part in the murder himself and believed he was more likely covering for his friend. Christopher had no criminal record, had been an honor student in school, and came from what appeared to be a respectable family. Based on that, detectives continued pressuring him over the next several hours. They warned Christopher that if he kept protecting Richard, they could both end up facing the death penalty, and told him that his only chance was to explain what had really happened. Eventually, the pressure began to work, and Christopher started changing his story. He first claimed that Richard had confessed to killing Nancy, but later changed his account again. This time, Christopher said that he had gone to the Pizza Hut with Richard, but remained outside while Richard committed the murder. However, when he repeated that version during a polygraph examination, the examiner concluded that he was being deceptive, and Christopher changed his story yet again. Finally, Christopher said that while they were drinking at Donna's house that night, Richard suggested robbing another Pizza Hut. They had access to a master key and knew that the money from the previous night would still be inside the safe. Christopher initially refused, but Richard eventually convinced him to go along with the plan. The following morning, they met near Nancy's restaurant at around 7. They watched her say goodbye to Todd and go inside, then followed her into the building. Using the master key, they opened the door and made their way to the kitchen, where Nancy was preparing the pizza dough. She knew both men and asked what they were doing there, but Richard responded by pulling out a gun and demanding the money. Nancy opened the safe and handed over the cash, after which Richard told Christopher to tie her hands. The two men then took turns sexually assaulting her before Richard shot her in the head, knowing that if Nancy survived, she would immediately give their names to the police. After Christopher told detectives this story, they placed him in a motel because he was still sharing an apartment with Richard, who might find out that he had spoken to police. Investigators spent the next several days preparing to make their arrests, and on November 15th, both men were taken into custody. Even then, though, prosecutors faced a serious problem. Under state law, a confession and witness testimony alone were not enough to secure a conviction, and since Richard still refused to admit any involvement, much of the case depended on the DNA evidence. Experts compared the biological profile recovered from the semen on Nancy's body with samples from both suspects, but the testing available at the time was extremely limited and nothing like the technology used today. In simple terms, it could rule someone out based on blood type and a small number of genetic markers, or show only that a suspect could not be excluded as a possible source. In Richard's case, the results showed that the semen definitely did not belong to him. Christopher, however, could not be fully excluded as the person who had left the sample. As for the hair found on the restaurant floor, prosecutors brought in an expert who compared it with Richard's hair under a microscope. He concluded that the two were very similar and could have come from the same person. The evidence was far from overwhelming, but together with Christopher's statements, it was enough for the case to move forward. Both men remained in jail while they waited for trial, and during that time, several incidents took place. On one occasion, Richard attacked Christopher, threw boiling water in his face, and shouted that he had snitched on him. About a week later, Christopher agreed to a deal in which prosecutors took the death penalty off the table in exchange for his testimony against Richard. As for Richard, prosecutors decided to charge him with sexual assault rather than murder. That charge required a less conclusive level of proof, while still carrying a possible life sentence. The trial began in January 1990, more than a year after Nancy's murder, and by then, Christopher's story had changed yet again. He had previously claimed that Richard was the one who shot Nancy, but now admitted that he himself had pulled the trigger. Christopher also described in greater detail what they had done to Nancy during the assault, and the testimony became so graphic that her mother grew ill and had to leave the courtroom. Christopher insisted he had not wanted to take part, but claimed that Richard forced him to do it by threatening him. According to Christopher, Richard later handed him the gun and ordered him to kill Nancy. Christopher shot her, and the two of them then dragged her into the restroom to wash away any possible evidence. They wiped down the surfaces they had touched, blocked the sink, and left the water running before moving Nancy's body into the hallway. Donna also testified, and what she told the jury did little to help Richard's case. She said that after his manager woke her that morning, she and Richard drove to the restaurant. She noticed that the driver's seat had been pushed much farther back than usual. The thing is, Donna had not given anyone permission to use her car. The keys had been hanging on a hook inside her home, and that morning they were still there. She also told the court that several days after the murder, while she and Richard were discussing what had happened, he looked at her and asked, "I was with you, right?" Prosecutors believed Richard had left the apartment early that morning while Donna was sleeping heavily, taken her car to Nancy's restaurant, committed the crime, and then returned to the apartment and gone back to bed, creating the appearance of an alibi. Richard continued to insist that the entire story was a lie and that he had never left Donna's apartment. But, despite his denials, the jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to life in prison. Several days later, Christopher received the same sentence, bringing the case to a close. Richard continued to deny any involvement and attempted to appeal his conviction, but before long, something happened that would permanently change his life. About a year after he was sentenced, another inmate attacked him and repeatedly kicked him in the head. Richard was rushed to the hospital, where doctors were forced to remove part of his brain. The injuries left him unable to care for himself, and he effectively became disabled, requiring constant medical assistance. Even so, once he was released from the hospital, he was returned to the general prison population, where he was abused by other inmates. His attorneys kept challenging the conviction, arguing that no physical evidence had ever connected Richard to the crime, and that, under state law, he could not legally be convicted based only on witness testimony. The appeals court, however, ruled that the circumstantial evidence was sufficient and allowed the conviction to stand. Christopher did not appeal because of the deal he had accepted, and for the next several years, the case appeared to be over. At least, that was how it seemed. In 1996, the Austin police chief received a letter, with copies also sent to a local newspaper and a civil rights organization. It had been written by a man named Achim Marino, who was serving 3 life sentences for sexual assault and robbery. In the letter, Marino claimed that he was the one who had murdered Nancy DePriest and said he could not understand why 2 other men had been sent to prison for the crime. He insisted that he had acted alone and had never met either Richard or Christopher. As for why he had decided to confess, Marino explained that he had become a Christian and now felt it was his duty to help free 2 innocent men. He described the crime in detail and said he could easily prove that he was responsible. Marino had been arrested for an unrelated offense only a few weeks after Nancy's murder, and some of the items he had taken from the restaurant were still being kept at his parents' home. So, he urged police to go there and collect them. The police chief assigned detectives to look into the tip, and soon they went to Marino's parents' home. There, they found 2 Pizza Hut bags normally used to carry cash, along with $150, the exact amount employees said should have been in the safe when Nancy arrived for work. Police also recovered a master key to the restaurants, along with a pair of handcuffs that Marino claimed he had initially used to restrain Nancy. But despite all of this, investigators were not ready to accept that Marino was the killer or that the other 2 men were innocent. The case made almost no progress over the next several years, and it was not until 1998 that detectives decided to speak with Christopher. They did not tell him everything they had learned, and instead asked whether a third person had been involved in Nancy's murder. Christopher said there had only been 2 of them and continued to stand by his confession. Investigators tried to find some connection between Marino, Christopher, and Richard, but they came up with nothing. They also learned that the gun Marino claimed to have used was still being stored by the El Paso Police Department, so they requested a ballistics examination. The results, however, could not confirm that the bullet recovered from Nancy's body had been fired from that weapon. So, with no definitive answer, police once again allowed the case to fade into the background. Christopher, however, could not stop wondering why detectives had suddenly come to question him, nearly 10 years after the crime. Some time later, he heard rumors that an inmate at another prison had confessed to Nancy's murder, but police did not believe him. Christopher began searching for organizations that helped wrongfully convicted prisoners and eventually wrote to the Wisconsin Innocence Project. The project had only recently been established and had not yet helped exonerate anyone, but the team became interested in Christopher's case. It was run by 2 professors at the University of Wisconsin Law School, who reviewed possible wrongful convictions with the help of their students. In his letter, Christopher claimed for the first time that he had nothing to do with Nancy's murder, and that his confession had been forced out of him. He said he had admitted to the crime only because he was terrified for his life. According to Christopher, detectives had convinced him that he was going to receive the death penalty, and that confessing was the only way to save himself. Christopher insisted that neither he nor Richard played any part in Nancy's murder. When police first brought him into the station, he genuinely believed they were simply interviewing everyone who worked for Pizza Hut. He had grown up in a law-abiding family and had always believed that police officers were supposed to protect people and help them. So he was completely unprepared for what happened next. One of the detectives, Hector Polanco, claimed that people on the streets called him the devil, and told Christopher that there was no way he was getting out of this. Over the next 20 hours, detectives kept him under constant pressure. Polanco repeatedly told Christopher that he would be sentenced to death. At one point, he grabbed Christopher's arm, pointed to a vein, and showed him where the lethal injection would go. He also showed him photographs from their other executions and told him that the same thing was going to happen to him. The detective then placed Nancy's autopsy photographs in front of Christopher and forced him to look at them. Christopher was not actually under arrest and was free to leave at any time, but he did not know that. When he asked for an attorney, investigators told him he could not have one until he had been formally charged. According to Christopher, Polanco also threw a chair in his direction, slammed his hands against the table, and screamed at him. He even said that Christopher would become fresh meat for the other prisoners once he was sent to jail. By the end of the interrogation, Christopher was so frightened and exhausted that he began agreeing with detectives simply because he wanted it to stop. He claimed they had given him no food or water and had not allowed him any real break from the questioning. Eventually, they told him that if he gave a statement against Richard, he would be allowed to go home. Christopher agreed, and detectives attempted to record his confession on camera. But it quickly became clear that he did not know important details about the crime, forcing the officers to repeatedly stop the recording and correct his account. Eventually, they realized they would not be able to record a confession that would hold up in court, so they brought in a typewriter instead. Christopher was told to sign a blank sheet of paper, and Detective Polanco then typed out a statement for him. At that point, Christopher still believed that the truth would eventually come out, and that his and Richard's innocence would become obvious. Instead, he was charged with murder, and told that the only way to avoid the death penalty was to accept a deal and testify against Richard at trial. Detectives still had no evidence directly linking Christopher to the crime, so, according to him, they told him to change his statement once again and claimed that he had fired the gun himself. This would make it easier to convict Richard of sexual assault, while still allowing prosecutors to seek a life sentence. Christopher also explained why, when detectives visited him in prison after receiving Marino's letter, he had once again insisted that his original testimony was true. By then, he had lost all faith in the police and believed they might be trying to set him up again, possibly destroying any chance he had of ever being released on parole. Because of that fear, Christopher decided to stick to the story he had already told, convinced that no one was truly trying to help him. After reading Christopher's letter, the Innocence Project tracked down the attorney who had represented him at trial. To their surprise, the lawyer claimed that the police had actually found Christopher's fingerprints on the murder weapon, and that 2 witnesses had seen both suspects near the restaurant that morning, making their guilt obvious. After hearing this, the team was ready to turn Christopher down, but before they did, they called him in prison and asked why he had left out such important information. Christopher insisted none of it was true, and begged them to check for themselves. When they did, they discovered that he was right. Police had never recovered the murder weapon, and there had been no witnesses that placed Christopher and Richard outside Nancy's restaurant. Christopher explained that he had repeatedly tried to tell his attorneys that his confession was false, but even they refused to believe him. Instead, they insisted that accepting a plea deal was his only chance of staying alive. Even Christopher's own mother begged him to take the deal, not because she thought he was guilty, but because she was terrified that he would be sentenced to death. At one point, the stress became so overwhelming that she was hospitalized with heart problems. And this was one of the reasons Christopher eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. The attorneys also discovered another disturbing fact. Several years earlier, Detective Polanco had been suspended after someone recorded him beating a suspect while trying to force a confession out of him. Despite that, Polanco was eventually reinstated and allowed to continue working as a detective. As they examined Christopher's confession more closely, the attorneys found several major inconsistencies. Christopher had claimed that Nancy was shot in the hallway, but the spent casing was found inside the men's room. Crime scene photographs also showed blood splatter on a bucket inside that same restroom, providing further evidence that this was where Nancy had actually been shot. The timeline made even less sense. As we know, Todd first drove Nancy to the restaurant, then took their daughter to the babysitter, and returned to give Nancy the car keys. Nancy came to the door, and everything appeared completely normal. Christopher, however, had claimed that he and Richard entered the restaurant immediately after Todd first dropped her off. If that had been true, Todd could not have returned nearly an hour later and found Nancy unharmed. By this point, the Innocence Project's attorneys were convinced that Christopher had nothing to do with the crime and began working on the case. They learned that the biological evidence recovered from Nancy's body was still being preserved, and in February 2000, they formally requested new DNA testing. DNA technology had advanced significantly by then, and when experts compared the semen recovered from Nancy's body with samples from Christopher and Richard, neither man matched. They then tested a sample from Achim Marino, and this time the result was conclusive. There was no doubt that the semen found on Nancy's body belonged to him. Experts also re-examined the hair recovered from the restaurant floor and determined that it did not belong to any of the three men. Since the original microscopic hair comparison had been one of the key pieces of evidence used against Richard, the new finding further undermined the entire case against him. Once the police department learned about these developments, investigators finally went to speak with Marino in person. He once again confessed and described Nancy's murder in remarkable detail. Marino said that on the morning that fateful day, he had been searching for a restaurant with only one employee inside, so he could rob it. He put on some work clothes, carried a folding ladder, and walked through the area looking for a suitable location. He first tried another restaurant on the same street, telling the employee that management had sent him to do some repairs. They let him inside, but when he realized the only person working there was a man, he left. Marino explained that he held a grudge against a blonde woman who had hurt him in the past. Because of that, he had decided that if he found another woman who looked like her, he would kill her, just for the thrill of it. Just a few minutes later, he knocked on the door of Nancy's Pizza Hut. She had no reason to suspect anything and believed his story about being there to perform repairs, so she allowed him inside. Marino remained in the restaurant for a while before pulling out a gun and sexually assaulting Nancy. He then took her into the restroom and told her that he was going to handcuff her to a pipe so she would not be able to call the police. But as soon as Nancy turned away from him, Marino shot her in the head. He then searched for the spent casing, but could not find it. Fearing that his fingerprints might be on it, he decided to flood the restaurant in hopes that the water would destroy any evidence he had left behind. Marino also told investigators that he had repeatedly tried to help free Christopher and Richard, but his letters to various officials had gone unanswered. In 1998, he had even written to George W. Bush, who was the governor of Texas at the time, but the letter was simply ignored. At that point, investigators had little doubt that Marino was the real killer, and that Christopher and Richard had spent nearly 12 years in prison for a crime they did not commit. Police requested another examination of the gun Marino claimed to have used, and this time, experts were able to confirm that the casing found inside Nancy's restaurant had been fired from that weapon. Combined with the DNA results, the ballistics evidence left no doubt that Marino was guilty, and in January 2001, a judge ordered Christopher's immediate release. Richard's situation was more complicated because his brain injury meant that he required constant medical care. His family needed several months to prepare their home for his return, but eventually he was released as well. Marino was then charged with Nancy's murder, although he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. He did not deny killing her, but claimed that he had been hearing voices and believed that human sacrifices would give him supernatural powers. Medical experts concluded that Marino had understood what he was doing, so prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty. Nancy's mother, however, asked them not to. She explained that the lives of two innocent men had already been destroyed and that she did not want another death added to everything that had happened. Marino was ultimately convicted and received another life sentence, in addition to the 3 life terms he was already serving for robbing and sexually assaulting other women. Christopher and Richard's attorneys later filed lawsuits against the authorities, and the cases were eventually settled. Christopher received $5 million, while Richard received more than $10 million. Richard's family also filed a separate lawsuit against Christopher, because it was his testimony that had sent Richard to prison. The two sides eventually reached a settlement under which Christopher paid Richard $500,000. Christopher repeatedly expressed his remorse for what had happened to Richard and said he felt responsible for his suffering. After his release, he enrolled at the University of Wisconsin Law School, the same university where the Innocence Project that had helped prove his innocence was based. He later worked as an attorney, but in 2021, Christopher found himself back in prison. He pleaded guilty in an investment fraud case and agreed, along with the other people involved, to repay the victims $3.5 million. As a result, he was sentenced to 29 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Richard spent the rest of his life under the constant care of relatives, unable to look after himself or perform even basic daily tasks without assistance. His condition continued to deteriorate over the years, and in 2021, he died of cancer at the age of 50. As for the detectives who had effectively pushed Christopher into confessing to Nancy's murder, their story ended very differently. A lawsuit was filed against them, but the court found insufficient evidence that they had forced Christopher to take responsibility for a crime he did not commit. As a result, none of the detectives faced any consequences, and all of them kept their jobs. But perhaps the most infuriating part involved Detective Polanco, the man Christopher said had placed him under the greatest pressure. After Polanco was temporarily suspended for allegedly forcing another suspect to confess, he sued the department, claiming he had been discriminated against because of his Mexican background. In the end, he was not only reinstated, but also awarded $290,000 in compensation. And that is how this complicated case finally came to an end, leaving nearly everyone involved with lasting damage. Except for the detectives, whose actions had helped destroy the lives of 2 innocent men, and who never faced any real consequences. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like if you appreciated the video. Thanks for watching.